I'm Jennifer Sanassi. You're watching News 24 Live, while Dick Vienman, the founder of The Right Conversation, is joining me on Skype. He's going to introduce us to a new way of looking at meaningful conversations. Now, Dick, before we get into it, why don't you tell us what exactly conversational leadership is?
Okay, conversational leadership is what we are naming a new style of leadership that is emerging to cope with a changing world. I guess historically leadership has been largely about controlling and about leaders telling people what to do. And that's been the predominant mindset and philosophy of leadership. Because of many changes in the world, that current model is no longer working. And what we're seeing is an emergence of a style of leadership which doesn't have telling at its heart, but which has conversations and dialogue as its defining features. In other words, it's about leaders enabling the right conversations to take place rather than always providing the answers. So, and we name that, and we put a label to that, if you like, called conversational leadership.
When you speak about these right conversations that leaders can be having with their staff or the people that they're leading, how do they know what to say, and how do they find the conversations that they need to be having?
How do leaders? Well, I guess what we're finding is that because the world is changing, it is no longer possible for leaders to know everything. So the key challenge for leaders is how do you tap into a very diverse and very mobile and increasingly young workforce who probably know more of the answers to the questions facing the organization than the leaders do. So it's not so much about the right conversations, it's about asking the right questions. And it's about accepting as a leader that you don't necessarily have the answer, but that the right conversations happen if you ask the right questions. So the genesis and the starting point for having the right conversations is to ask the right questions. And that's a challenge for leaders. And it's a challenge because it presupposes that they always know the answer. And that it doesn't always sit comfortably with what some people think leadership is about, which is having the answer. So promoting the right conversations starts with asking the right questions. And that is increasingly a challenge for leaders. How do I do that? Who do I ask? And do I legitimize a conversation once I ask the question?
You just mentioned that it's definitely a challenge, I think, for some leaders to make this mind shift. How do they go from transitioning to the traditional way of leadership to now going into this more conversational and question-based leading?
Okay, well, there's two triggers for leaders to start to think about this. The first is a sort of rational, it's important for my business. And I think if you look at the world in which organizations increasingly have to operate, it is about knowledge, it is about millennials coming into the workplace. It is about this rise of reference where people go externally for information. And to compete in that world, you need to create a culture where those kinds of people can operate. So there's a very compelling, logical business reason why, as a leader, you need to build cultures where that is the norm rather than the exception. So that's a rational reason people start to think about this. A more emotive reason, which often sits alongside that, is that you need to help leaders and leadership teams to reflect on how they talk. And by holding up a mirror to teams, and to leaders, you could say, actually, this is how you talk typically. This is what defines the way you interact with people. Do you think that is helpful? And very often, the fact of holding up a mirror is a start for people to think, no, that is probably not very helpful. So if you bring those two together, an emerging new world where dialogue and conversation is increasingly the way you need to operate, and some heightened self-awareness about, am I enabling that? You put those two together, people will start to make changes. Not everyone, clearly, but that tends to be the trigger for most leaders and leadership teams to think about this, and at least to start to talk about, do we need to change what we do?
What problems can arise from non-constructive conversation between management and staff?
You name it, and we have a very simple view that most things in most corporations start with either a good or a bad conversation. So the potential consequences of bad dialogue, bad conversations are huge. They play out in how engaged people feel. If you talk to employment lawyers, they will say that nearly all tribunals, all disputes, legal disputes between employees and organizations are the result of a bad conversation much earlier in the process, but it wasn't paid attention to. A failure to innovate is the result of people not talking together. Failure to collaborate, which is another defining feature of the modern economy, is all about people not having the right conversations. And that's before you get to very major issues like reputation threatening events, which are not discussed within companies. And there's lots of examples of terrible things that have happened which were simply not talked about because it wasn't okay to talk about them. So I think the consequences of poor dialogue and poor conversations are enormous, absolutely huge, and something you ignore at your peril, therefore.
Now, can you tell us what exactly a bad conversation is? We know it's a conversation that hasn't gone well, but what are the components that make up one of these bad conversations that could lead to a dispute later on?
A number of issues. The most obvious one is that we have not reached what the point of any conversation is, which is shared meaning. We have interpreted what happened differently, and that happens all the time. There's a very obvious assumption that many people make, which is if you've said something, people have understood it. That is not the case. So the effort goes into saying and not into checking understanding. So the single biggest thing that goes wrong is there isn't shared meaning. Out of that, you also get all sorts of other issues about people not feeling heard, potentially important issues not being discussed. But the fundamental point, the fundamental issue is around a lack of shared meaning and the absolute assumption many of us have that just by having a conversation, we agree. It's not the case, and there's far too little listening that takes part as part of conversations, and probably far too much talking, especially by senior people. You can't impose meaning on other people just by talking at them. You co-create it by talking, and we forget that. Not just at work, but at home and in all sorts of walks of life.